The night I ruined everything, the kitchen smelled like burnt basil and regret, and I swear the sound of my heartbeat was louder than the shattering plate that started it all. I remember standing there with my palms sweating, staring at the mess on the floor, knowing, truly knowing, that nothing about my life would ever be the same again. Maybe it was the way he looked at me across the counter, or maybe it was the way I pretended not to notice. But in that moment, when the steam rose in slow spirals toward the ceiling, I realized I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And if stories like this make you feel the way I did that night, torn between desire and consequence, between the truth and the lie you wish you could keep alive, then go ahead and like, share, and subscribe. It means more than you think. It helps these confessions reach someone who might be living the same quiet storm. I didn't notice him the first week he worked there. At least, that's what I told myself later when everything fell apart. But if I'm being honest with you, he had been slipping into my awareness long before I admitted it. Maybe it was the way he handled ingredients with a kind of reverence, or the way he spoke to food the same way some people speak to children, softly, patiently, like it might break if he raised his voice. Whatever it was, it lingered in the air around him, subtle and warm, like the scent of roasted garlic that clung to his sleeves. The kitchen was already overheating that night, and I remember wiping my forehead with the back of my wrist as he worked beside me, the lamps above us casting a muted gold that softened the edges of everything. I could hear the scrape of his knife against the board, steady and rhythmic, almost like a form of breathing. My partner always teased me for romanticizing ordinary things, but in that moment, even I knew I was paying too much attention. I told myself it was just admiration, nothing more, nothing less. Chefs were supposed to move like that, confident, measured, sure. But I felt something twist inside me when he leaned over to taste the sauce I'd been simmering and exhaled a quiet hum of approval. "You come alive when you cook," he said one night without looking at me. "Most people don't. Most people only pretend." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. Compliments from strangers always made me uneasy, but compliments from him felt like they were peeling back layers I didn't realize I still had. I tried to focus on my task, on the pasta dough beneath my palms, warm and familiar, but I could feel his eyes flick toward me every so often. Not bold, not obvious, just enough to make my pulse tick upward. My partner had been distant for months. We pretended we were fine because pretending was easier than admitting we were drifting. We stopped talking about our days, stopped asking each other where we hurt, stopped holding each other with the kind of tenderness we once promised we'd never let fade. I kept telling myself all relationships went through cycles, that this was just a winter we'd thaw out of eventually. But the truth was simpler and far less poetic. We were sinking, slowly, quietly, and neither of us cared enough to swim harder. Maybe that's why the chef's attention felt like a lifeline. Not love, not desire, just warmth. A spark. The feeling of being truly seen when you've spent far too long dimming your own light so someone else wouldn't feel threatened by it. He wasn't replacing anything. He was just reminding me of a version of myself I thought I'd lost. One night, the restaurant closed early because of a storm. Thunder rattled the glass, and rain smudged the streetlights outside until they looked like blurred halos. Inside, it was calm, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint hiss of the burners cooling down. He stayed behind to clean. I stayed because I told myself it would be rude to leave him alone, even though he never asked for company. We worked in silence for a while, moving around each other with an ease that felt too natural. At one point, our hands brushed when we reached for the same towel. It should have meant nothing. A simple accident. But I felt that small contact all the way up my arm, like a pulse skipping a beat. He paused, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before pulling back. "Timing," he murmured, almost to himself. "In cooking, in life, timing is everything." I didn't know what he meant, not then, not fully. But the way he said it made something inside me tremble. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, why his voice sounded so gentle, why his eyes looked like he was seeing straight through me. But I didn't dare. Instead, I dried my hands slowly and told myself I was imagining the tension curling between us. That the storm outside was influencing my thoughts. That I was lonely, and loneliness makes shadows look like silhouettes. But when I left the kitchen that night, the warmth of his earlier glance followed me all the way to my car, clinging to me more stubbornly than the scent of smoke and rosemary. And as I sat behind the wheel, listening to the rain drum against the windshield, I realized something had shifted, small, quiet, almost invisible. A crack in the glass. A hairline fracture I pretended wasn't there. But deep down, I already knew it was only the beginning. The days that followed felt unnaturally vivid, as if the world around me had sharpened without my permission. Colors seemed deeper. Sounds lingered longer. Even the simplest actions, washing herbs, slicing onions, kneading dough, felt charged with an energy I didn't want to name. I kept telling myself it was the weather, or the stress, or maybe the monotony of my life finally cracking open. But each time I stepped through the restaurant's back door, I felt something inside me straighten, like my body knew before my mind did that he was somewhere in the building. He started arriving earlier than usual. Or maybe I just began noticing the exact moment he entered a room. I'd hear the soft thud of his shoes or the rustle of his apron being tied, and a warmth would spread through me that didn't belong to friendship. I tried to hide it. I really did. I'd bury myself in prep work, pretending the rhythmic motions were enough to silence whatever was waking up inside me. But he had a way of moving that pulled my attention toward him without effort, like gravity disguised as coincidence. One afternoon, he handed me a bowl of simmering sauce and asked me to taste it. Our fingers brushed again, just briefly, but it felt deliberate this time. Intentional. I lifted the spoon to my lips, trying to steady my breath, and the flavor bloomed across my tongue, rich, slow, comforting. I closed my eyes because that's what you do when something moves through you too deeply. When I opened them, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "You taste things like they mean something," he said gently. "Most people don't." I wanted to respond, to brush off the comment with a joke or a shrug, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I set the bowl down and turned away, hoping he wouldn't see the faint tremor in my hands. Back home, the distance with my partner felt even more suffocating. Conversations dried up into half sentences, then into silence. We barely touched anymore. When we did, it felt like obligation rather than affection. I kept waiting for us to find our way back to each other, but the path between us had become overgrown with everything we refused to acknowledge. I wondered if they noticed my restlessness, the way I kept glancing at my phone even when I knew no message was coming. If they did, they never said a word. One night, after a particularly busy service, a fuse blew in the kitchen and the lights flickered out except for a few emergency bulbs. The restaurant emptied quickly, but he stayed behind, checking equipment, making sure nothing had burned. I stayed too, pretending I needed to reorganize the pantry. In truth, I didn't want to leave him alone in the half-darkness, and I didn't want the night to end just yet. The dim light softened everything: his face, his voice, the air between us. Shadows curled around the counters like they were listening. He leaned against the stainless steel table, wiping his hands on a towel, and said my name in a tone that made the room feel smaller. "You know," he whispered, "some people meet at the wrong time, but that doesn't make the connection less real." The words settled over me like warm steam, curling into the spaces I'd been trying to keep empty. My breath caught, quiet but noticeable. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I didn't pretend I didn't understand the shift happening between us. I should have walked away. I should have said something practical or responsible, something that could have severed the moment cleanly. But instead, I let the silence stretch. I let it wrap around us like a fragile thread pulling taut. He stepped closer, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The scent of basil and smoke lingered on him, blending with the faint sweetness of the dessert the pastry chef had prepared earlier. My heart was loud in my ears, embarrassingly loud, and when he spoke again, the sound vibrated through me. "Tell me to stop," he breathed. I couldn't. My throat was tight, my mind too full of everything I'd been trying to deny. I stared at the floor, at the faint reflection of our silhouettes in the polished tile, and I felt an ache bloom in my chest, gentle, dangerous, consuming. "I don't know what this is," I whispered. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, like he'd been rehearsing for it. "It's timing," he said, "and timing is cruel." The room felt suspended, like time itself was holding its breath. I finally stepped back, breaking the invisible pull between us, but the moment had already branded itself into my ribs. That night, as I walked home under streetlights blurred by mist, everything felt heavier and lighter at once. I knew I was slipping into something I didn't have the strength to resist. And even though nothing had happened, nothing visible, nothing physical, the truth was undeniable. A recipe had begun forming between us. One neither of us should have tasted, but one we both already craved. I should have known the truth wouldn't stay quiet. Secrets have a way of simmering under the lid, building pressure until even the smallest shake can send everything spilling over. And that morning, before the sun had even burned through the fog, I felt it. The shift, the warning, the unmistakable heaviness that settles in the air just before something breaks. The restaurant was unusually silent when I walked in. No clatter, no idle chatter, no hum of early prep, just a tight, brittle quiet that made the hairs on my arms rise. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was already there, leaning over the counter with his hands braced against the metal, shoulders drawn tight. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw it, fear, guilt, maybe even a flicker of resolve. But before I could speak, the back door swung open, and my partner stepped inside. My heart stumbled. They shouldn't have been there. They never came to the restaurant unannounced. Their eyes scanned the room, landing on him first, then on me, and the expression that crossed their face will stay with me for the rest of my life, an expression of someone who has just confirmed the suspicion they prayed was wrong. "I found your messages," they said quietly. My stomach dropped, not because there was anything explicit in those texts. There was. Nothing but half-sentences, late-night check-ins, too warm compliments, and timing metaphors that meant more than either of us admitted. But sometimes the danger isn't in the words themselves, it's in what they reveal about the heart behind them. I opened my mouth, but all that came out was a breath. A stunned, useless breath. My partner looked at me like I was a stranger wearing someone they used to love. "I asked you," they said, voice trembling. "I asked you if something was going on, you said no." I did. I said no because technically nothing had happened. But in that moment, the technicalities felt like lies. And the silence between my partner's question and my answer felt louder than anything I could have confessed. The chef stepped forward, not touching me, but close enough that the air between us stirred. "This is my fault," he said. "Don't blame." "Don't," I whispered sharply, because hearing him take the blame made something inside me collapse. He stopped speaking, but the damage was already unfolding like smoke. My partner turned to him, eyes burning with betrayal. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I wouldn't see the way you look at them?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was hanging between us in the steam-filled air, thick and undeniable. I felt the room shrinking, the walls pushing in, the metal counters reflecting every raw edge of the moment. "I trusted you," my partner said to me. "I trusted us." I wanted to reach for their hand, to anchor us to something real, something solid, something not yet ruined. But my body wouldn't move. I just stood there, suspended between two people I'd broken without meaning to. The argument escalated, not loud, but sharp. Their voice wavered between accusation and heartbreak, and every word felt like a knife dragging across my ribs. I kept trying to explain, but explanations sounded pathetic when the evidence was already painted across my face. At some point, the chef stepped back, shoulders slumping, eyes lowered. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, as if the weight of the moment was physically bending him. I felt guilt coil around my throat, tightening with every second. My partner finally turned away from him and looked at me, really looked. And in that look, I saw everything: love, fear, disappointment, exhaustion. A whole shared history held in one trembling exhale. "Why didn't you just tell me?" they whispered. I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, but the words were too tangled with shame to leave my mouth. So I stood there in silence, watching the person who once held my entire world slowly unravel right in front of me. They left without slamming the door. Somehow, that made it worse. At least anger would have given me something sharp to hold on to. But their quiet exit felt like a final verdict, heavy, devastating, irreversible. The chef tried to step closer, maybe to comfort me, maybe to apologize again, but I shook my head. I couldn't bear his closeness, not when it had cost me so much. He hesitated, then nodded as if he understood the distance suddenly carved between us. The kitchen felt colder after they were gone. The hum of the fridge returned, the lights flickered, and life carried on as if my world hadn't just cracked open. I leaned against the counter, pressing my palms into the metal, trying to steady my breath. But the truth settled over me like steam rising from a ruined dish, visible, inescapable, lingering long after the heat had faded. Something had boiled over, and there was no way to clean it up without burning myself all over again. The days after everything fell apart were quieter than I ever expected. Not peaceful, but hollow, like the sound of footsteps echoing through an empty apartment. The restaurant still smelled of roasted garlic and burnt olive oil, but it no longer held warmth for me. I passed by the kitchen door without looking inside, as if ignoring it could somehow erase what had happened. But the memory of him lingered there, suspended in the fluorescent glow and stainless steel. Every glance, every brush of a hand, every whispered word etched into the corners of the room. I returned to my apartment to find it too big, too still. My partner's absence was palpable in every object. The chair they always left slightly pulled back, the coffee mug they forgot on the counter, the faint scent of their shampoo that I could no longer ignore. Nights became the hardest. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster the same way I traced the moments that had led to this disaster. How did something so small, so seemingly harmless, grow into a rupture I could never fix? I tried to find solace in routine, in cooking meals for one, in making the apartment smell like something edible and ordinary. But the act of cooking had changed. Ingredients no longer spoke the same language. Every chopping board, every simmering pot reminded me of the secret recipe I once tasted and the consequences I couldn't undo. I realized too late that intimacy isn't measured by what you touch, but by what you withhold. The chef hadn't done anything unforgivable, really. We hadn't crossed the line everyone feared. But the line in my heart had already shifted, and that was enough to destroy what I had thought unbreakable. Occasionally, I ran into him. Not at the restaurant, we both avoided that now, but on the street, in the market, in the quiet corners of the city where the world seemed too large to notice us. He would nod politely, a faint, apologetic smile, but the warmth I once sought was gone. I realized then that connection isn't always about proximity. Some bonds are meant to linger in memory, not in life. Some flames aren't meant to burn, they're meant to leave an indelible mark before fading. I began writing in a journal again, something I hadn't done in years. Each word felt like an attempt to stitch together the pieces of myself that had splintered in the chaos of desire, betrayal, and guilt. I wrote about him, about my partner, about the tension between love and longing, about the mistakes that no one sees until they're reflected in a shattered mirror. Writing became the only way to breathe, the only way to reconcile the self I had been with the self I had become. Nights still come, though, when I smell basil or hear the scrape of a knife on a chopping board. And in those moments, the past rushes back, vivid and unrelenting. I feel the brush of his fingers, the weight of unspoken words, the quiet understanding that timing is cruel. I think about my partner and the way their trust fractured under the weight of my silence. I think about choices made in moments of weakness and desire, and I wonder if anything could have been different. But life moves forward. I go to the market, I cook, I breathe, and I remember. I remember the heat of the kitchen, the rain-streaked streets, the intensity of forbidden longing, and the way guilt tastes sharper than salt on the tongue. I have learned that some dishes aren't meant to be finished, not because the ingredients were bad, but because the timing was wrong, because the hands that stirred them weren't ready for the recipe life demanded. And so, I leave that chapter behind, quietly, tenderly, like a plate half-cleared, the flavors lingering, the memory intact. I have nothing left to apologize for except the mistakes themselves. Nothing left to fix except the self I now carry forward, bruised but learning to be careful with fire, with love, with timing. Sometimes I whisper the lesson aloud to no one, timing is everything. And sometimes, too late, I understand it.